to this third session of our seminar series. So I'm very happy to welcome Matthew Cole to speak. Matthew is a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute working on the Fairwork project, and we were very happy when he accepted our invitation because we think, this is a very interesting topic for social policy, transformation of work, what, the working condition, pay, and job security of gig economy and platform work pose a big challenge to social policy research and to policymakers. And so the Fairwork project, and I'm sure Matthew will tell us a lot about it in his presentation, it's a very interesting project, not only because it's a really large project, it looks at very different parts of the world from Asia, Latin America to Europe, but also because it has this peculiar approach of being both aiming to transformation, to implement action for transformation, to move platform work towards more fair forms of work, and also like a scientific objective or learning what's out there, how is platform work and the gig economy actually being implemented in different places. So I'm very happy to leave the floor to Matthew to tell us more about this exciting project.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm gonna share my screen and then give you a little bit of a outline of the presentation. So bear with me. All right, so hopefully it's all working. Right, so I'm gonna start out with a little bit of background on how I conceptualize the platform economy, and I guess some of the underlying conditions that may have given rise to the necessity of this project, and thinking through the policy implications and why the research is important. So this sort of begins with, the fall of labor. And so to understand the rise of the platform economy and the research project and the sort of policy implications, which is basically the structure of this presentation, I wanted to preface that with acknowledging the overall downward trend in the labor share of income globally, but particularly in the four largest world economies, the US, Japan, China, and Germany. There's numerous different studies that show that since the 1970s and the rise of different sort of monetarist and other kinds of policy and industrial strategy and governance approaches, we've seen a sort of rise of inequality. And Thomas Piketty's charted this in his book. This is sort of well established, but lots of the sort of causes for that, there's a lot more debate around. But there's a recent paper by Stansbury and Summers that kind of traces a lot of this, at least in the US, and I imagine in other contexts as well, as being linked to a fall in worker power. And worker power is what you think it would be, fairly straightforward, the sort of threat of labor through union or collective bargaining as a mechanism to sort of retain the labor share of income and rents to labor, right? So they outline these four different conditions: financial deregulation, increased competition in the labor market due to sort of globalization in various ways, and sort of the export of new technology, changes within firm structure that prioritize shareholder power and sort of short-termism, outsourcing and subcontracting, more directly related to the platform economy, and the overall erosion of workers' rights in terms of labor market regulation, collective bargaining, sectoral collective bargaining, and so on. And I'd add a fifth factor that is more specifically technology related, rather than sort of nesting technology within the second factor, which is sort of rise of ICT and digital deepening, the generalization of data mobile data and the use of artificial intelligence and other sort of tools. These are the sort of foundations of the platform economy. Can't seem to make my slides go. There we go. So while you have the fall of labor, you also have the rise of platform capital. I'm sure many of you are familiar that the sort of top 5 companies in the world are all tech related. That's changed from recent like 10 years ago when oil companies were part of that top 5. And this is a huge sort of technological shift. Some of the platforms that no doubt all of you have used, Uber, Deliveroo amongst them, all of these, Instacart and TaskRabbit, which are less popular here in the UK, but more popular in the US. All of these are experiencing exponential growth over the past few years, especially with the pandemic. So, you have billions in funding raised over different rounds. You have a staggering number of monthly app downloads, in the millions for all but TaskRabbit. So you have these 2 simultaneous processes going on. And this is the kind of political economic pretext for what I'm going to talk about next, which is more specifically about the platform, the Fairwork project. So the injection of capital and the sort of rise of normalization of mobile data and the sort of different technological infrastructures have embedded platforms in our daily lives. So this has been referred to as a sort of double or bifocal movement, entailing the platformization of infrastructure and the infrastructuralization of platforms. So you have this sort of double movement, and yet traditional infrastructures were at least publicly owned. In this country, much of that has been sold off, like the water is privatized, phone company, BT privatized, all these sorts of things, Royal Mail and so on. So in a way, there's this sort of privatized governance mechanisms that characterize some of the more well-known platforms that I just referred to have already been adopted by certain companies, but you sort of have a more general platformization of traditional infrastructure. And this is not a good thing for democracy or accountability because of the way that platforms are structured and their governance mechanisms. And you only see this spreading. So, particularly in the global South, where it's sort of in the like lower income countries and developing countries, you don't have the same levels of like established traditional infrastructure. Platforms can spread much faster because mobile data and mobile networks are much easier to install than some of the more traditional ones, right? At the same time, there's a huge debate over numbers of platform workers and whether or not it is or isn't significant. But overall, the trajectory is fairly clear across Europe, at least, and the globe. You have the sort of increase in Britain. Even before the pandemic, you had a doubling in 3 years. In other places, it's been higher, but we don't have time too much to get into that. So one of the things, another sort of important distinction and sort of conceptual premise to the talking about Fairwork is our terminology. So platforms can be a wide variety of different things. Digital labor platforms are a specific type of platform within this overall platform economy. So that the way that we define it is a company that uses digital resources to mediate value-creating interactions between consumers and individual service-providing workers, right? So it digitally mediates transactions of labor. This is kind of taking, almost like taking Uber's word for what taking Uber at its word in some ways, because they are a digital mediator, but they're also an employer in if you move beyond the sort of legal context. And anyway, within that category, we have sort of two different types. One type of platform that's geographically tethered, and the other is cloud work. We sort of simplify the range of different platforms by these two different categories for like methodological purposes. But it's fairly clear, like geographically tethered is what it says it is. There's a lot of delivery or sort of cleaning or home maintenance type of platforms, and cloud work is anything that's not tied specifically to a location. There's been other typologies, such as the diagram here, which tries to map platforms according to sort of control and autonomy and local versus global, which is the sort of axes along which we're working. That diagram is taken from some work that my colleagues did at Leeds when I used to work there around social protection in the platform economy. So all of that to say, the Fairwork project has emerged in this context, and what it's trying to do through action research is evaluate different platforms, cloud work, gig work, according to principles that, if we sort of minimum thresholds essentially around these 5 different categories: fair pay, conditions, contracts, management, and representation. And these are sort of minimum thresholds for a degree of fairness. And there's a little bit more detail in the next slide, but basically these principles were created with the ILO and consultations with workers and unions, and I believe also some platforms themselves, to establish like minimum floors. And I won't read through all of them because these are available on the website. But the idea is that by rating platforms according to these different conditions and evaluating them, we can try to use various levers to try to improve working conditions globally. So platforms are not nationally bounded, and neither is this project. So the way that we sort of proceed in this research is that cloud work and gig work are separate. So cloud work is its own sort of research stream, and it's a little bit more difficult to estimate what constitutes minimum thresholds for the 5 different principles, such as minimum wages, and they can vary greatly depending on where the worker is located, depending on the cost of living, and sort of risks when you're working through your computer are far different than if you're working on a bike in snowy weather, so on and so forth, right? So we have different sets of principles, but the point is that each of the 5 principles has 2 different levels, and to meet the minimum threshold, you get 1 point, and then there's an additional one. So for gig work, for instance, if every single worker gets paid the local minimum wage after costs, including fuel can also be food, maintenance, congestion charges if you're a driver, right? If they make local minimum wage after all those costs, then they get a point. If they make the local living wage after those costs, they get a 2nd point. The same works for the rest of the principles. I just noticed that I'm missing number 3, but that's okay. Around contracts, contracts are really important, and one of the sort of key issues around which gig work is being fought at the moment in terms of recognition of regular hours and getting the same benefits that other workers who have a more traditional employment contract would get. So this is what our scorecard looks like. So you get the basic point for each category, and then an advanced point if based on the data from interviews, and if the platform cooperates and provides data to us from their end, we can also use that to supplement worker data, but we largely want this to be driven by sort of not by the platform management, but by our own empirical research. And usually that means that we look at 6 to 10, we interview 6 to 10 workers, not to find a representative sample, but to find the sort of weakest link. I'll say a little bit more about that in the next slide. But each platform will be evaluated according to this framework and scored out of 10. And this can be quite a difficult process, and there's a degree of interpretation involved often, and we try to think sort of strategically about how we can use our scoring to leverage better working conditions. So, for example, if a company is right on the edge of receiving a point and they've been engaging with us, and then usually we'll ask them, oh, if you change this policy, then you may get a point. And that has actually worked in several different cases in several different countries where we've been able to get the company to change the policy, which has, because of the scale of the platform economy, can have exponential effects on the labor market. Just taking time. So the first few years and each year subsequently, we reevaluate the principles, because as the labor market, regulatory context, political economic context, obviously like with COVID, so many things are changing. We want to make sure that the principles are evolving to meet the needs of workers and to accurately assess what is fair work. So we start out with the principles, and then we sort of have periodic stakeholder consultations involving gig workers. There are country level stakeholder consultations, and our sort of yearly field work across all countries. These all feed into changes to the principles, and it doesn't mean we change all the principles every year. That would be a bit unfair, but there's sort of slight tweaks or slight improvements, and then we reevaluate based on those each year. So it's a sort of organic and ongoing action research project. In terms of how we actually go about getting our data, it's 3 main sources: through desk research, which, as the world moves increasingly online, is easier and easier, but often there are hard limitations. So some of the online work companies, there are worker forums, there's sort of freely available documentation online that you can sort of ascertain like where platforms are operating. Like Uber provides information about all the cities that they're operating. But then, this is usually just publicly facing stuff. So to get the real like qualitative data, the stuff that's actually going to expose what the real issues are, we obviously need to do interviews, and largely that comes from worker interviews, but we do also interview platform managers if they are up for it. They often are not, but some can be more cooperative. And for instance, in India, we've had some quite enthusiastic involvement by certain platforms who've taken it on board and wanted to sort of be the leading, the highest rated platform in India, and that can be a really positive and really concrete way of improving working conditions by having that engagement. So it's a little bit different than a sort of a more traditional sort of antagonistic approach in a kind of like trade union context, but we're a sort of floating mediator in that way. But yeah, as I said before, in terms of ratings, we sometimes get a question or a little bit of like criticism that we're not interviewing enough people. 6 to 10 isn't a representative sample, but we're again not looking for a representative sample. We're finding the weakest links. So for instance, any worker that has a documented case where they're not earning minimum wage, or they've not been paid on time, or they've never received a contract, or they've received a contract that is different to another worker that doesn't meet our conditions, or they've been actively discriminated against by management, or they've experienced discrimination in their work and it hasn't been they haven't experienced any support. And one person that's doing that is too many, because then we're not going to award the point. So that's basically the weakest link method. We've produced scores now for 3 different countries. South Africa was one of our sort of initial sort of experimenting places. I wasn't with the project at the time, so I can't really speak to it, but this is what our scorecard looks like for South Africa. And there are more sort of higher scoring platforms here than some other countries that we're investigating right now, like the UK. You might not see this sort of distribution, and the way that it changes year to year is really interesting. But we try to get a spread of different platforms to show that there are sort of like, to show Uber, for example, or Bolt, that there are platforms already working with this model that meet the criteria, and sort of uses another lever to try to get them to do better. Germany is another country that we carried out research in last year. It's our scorecard for Germany. You have a slightly different distribution here. It's interesting that while the platform economy is global, there's only a few platforms that are truly operating in all different, or like multiple regions of the world. And we try to engage, if we're like Uber, for example, if we're rating them in one region, we try to also rate them in another. And they don't always, the ratings sometimes differ because the management differs, right? So Uber in South Africa got 4 points, and Uber in Germany only got 1. In India, they also got 1, but you also have a sort of a different distribution, where there's a lot of platforms that are only getting a few points and a few that have topped it out. So for example, like Urban Company and Flipkart were both vying for that first position when we were kind of negotiating, and one was trying to change their policies at the end so they could get that last point, but it didn't end up happening. So this is an action research project, and it's impact driven. It's not necessarily a more traditional academic exercise, because without documenting really concrete changes, our funders would be unhappy. So also we would be unhappy, because the whole point is to try to change things, right? We're engaging in sort of 4 different fronts, as you see. There's our engagement with the platforms themselves, and that's the sort of key thing, and where we're having success in trying to leverage our data and sort of show them that there's a better way of doing things, and trying to get them to change willingly. But volunteerism only goes so far, right? So we also need to engage and try to support organized labor. There's been lots of work done by the ILO, by other sort of NGOs around the platform economy and trying to improve conditions there. But some of the more traditional trade unions have been a little bit slower to act. They have their reasons, largely because their membership is based in a more traditional workforce, and they've been on the back foot fighting defensive struggles for a long time. But they're nonetheless, we're the most important actors here, and so we're sort of we have a sort of toolkit or a worker center on our website as well that tries to use Fairwork as a platform itself to link up organized labor, like whether it be unions or legal resources or various apps and trackers that workers can use to actually track their time. We have those resources available. And then policymakers in government, one of the focuses of this talk is the policy angle. And we're trying to sort of set the agenda, and in addition to helping move through in different country and regional contexts, sort of sharing knowledge of best practice. So like in South Africa, for example, we produced a sort of best practice report around how, with sort of recommendations about how to change the legal framework to improve working conditions there. And then we have another another aspect, which is just getting going, that I'm helping lead, called this, we're calling it social transformation, but that essentially addresses the sort of consumers and investors side, where we use the sort of model, the Living Wage Foundation, and before them in sort of commodity chains, the sort of fair trade initiatives to get people to sort of voluntarily support and sign up to a sort of Fair Work charter, where they support fair work, or they're involved at a higher level as a Fair Work partner, where they only try to procure services from higher rated platforms. And this is an initiative we're just rolling out now, and hope to incorporate that into all of our expansion countries. All right, so I skipped ahead a little bit. So yeah, this describes what I was talking about in a little bit more detail. We have the two different tiers, and again, we're sort of leveraging the sort of networked effects of local government, churches, charities, universities, schools, to put consumer side pressure, like demand side pressure on platforms. And there are various other initiatives that this is sort of inspired by and has drawn upon. For example, in the United States, there was a anti-sweatshop campaign called the Designated Suppliers Program that looked to like university buying power to influence fairer conditions down the supply chain. There are some other like voluntary initiatives that certain corporations are doing, like Unilever just announced they're going to investigate their supply chains and try to ensure everyone's paid a living wage and so on. So whether or not these are going to have lasting effects, that comes down to how much we can scale and how many people we can sign up. But there seems to be a critical mass at which everyone starts to want to get on board. So if you look at the Living Wage Foundation and their growth, you can sort of copy that. So we hope it goes as well as that has gone. Which leads me to sort of where we're expanding to. We're working with GIZ in Berlin and establishing, sort of growing the project by sharing between Oxford and Berlin. And we're expanding the research into many, I think 10 countries this year, with a view to maybe 13 or more. So at the moment, we've got partners or are sort of germinating in all of these different places, and hope to be active on 5 continents, and ratings be applied to an estimated 20 million gig workers in a couple of years, once we sort of finish this phase of the project. So we're sort of thinking like a platform in a way, the way we scale and the sort of leveraging that influence. How much we're on time. So that's a kind of summary of the context in which platforms arise, the actual operations and of the Fairwork project. And now I kind of wanted to think a little bit more broadly in terms of what dilemmas the platform economy and the sort of technological changes that are associated with it might present for platform workers, but also people who are policymakers and working in policy, since that's the sort of, I was invited by the policy group here at Oxford. So there are 2 things that I think are important to keep in mind, which is the rise of data as capital. So this is related to the sort of platformization of infrastructure, or even the platform model as a market leading model of business organization. There's a couple of people writing about this at the moment, but I see this sort of data capture and scaling through various digital means as this sort of the norm now, and it will become increasingly diffuse. The global volume of data in absolute terms is growing massively. Whether, not all this data is useful, a lot of it's just like crappy shows on Netflix, but at the same time, it's already $1 billion industry, in 2018, and now with all of our lives mediated in some way through Zoom, Teams, our mobile phone, TikTok, whatever, and including our working lives, this is going to only increase the sort of data as capital. This is part of a broader shift towards a rise in intellectual property, in intangible investment in assets, and the way that revenues get extracted from them. So there's that famous book, Capitalism Without Capital. There are a number of different people, that's by Haskell and Westlake. There are a number of people thinking about this, and the way that we are moving, or the way in that economic rents are being extracted through different platforms, not just labor platforms, right? And the sort of other side of that, of data as capital, is the datafication of labor, in that we have sort of various tracking mechanisms, but also the actual processes of our sort of daily lives are able to be sort of quantified in ways previously that weren't possible. And we've sort of so the EU is thinking about these issues. There's a high-level expert group on impacted digital transformation. There's a high-level expert group on AI. There's all these different groups thinking about these issues, and there's a sort of growing consensus that private data should be considered part of labor in terms of work. And if we think about it that way, then this raises another sort of issue in the traditional value production, whatever framework you're using is based either on as labor as an input or cost if you're sort of mainstream, or abstract labor time and surplus labor if you're Marxist. But either way, there's a sort of traditional labor component, but then there's this other component of the data that is produced as an excess on top of that. I think Shoshana Zuboff calls this a behavioral surplus. I think this is a clumsy term, but there is a sort of data component here that means there's a sort of dual value extraction. So how do we think about those issues in terms of equality and redistribution and justice and privacy and regulatory frameworks? There's not enough being done around that. So for example, most existing labor market policy, at least at the European level, and I use Europe because they're kind of at the forefront of thinking of how to regulate technological change. The US isn't really interested, and China is a whole nother can of worms. And so I'm sort of using Europe as the sort of progressive beacon here. But most of the labor market policy is around, like, in relation to like digital automation and platform economy and so on, is based around lifelong learning and skills and training programs, reskilling and so on. There are a lot of the social protections are based on older social welfare kind of policies, the legacy policies that are often sort of outdated. There is new legislation as of 2019 that I think is still in process that is granting new rights for workers on atypical contracts, which is sort of designed specifically to set a minimum floor around gig economy work. This is not unlike the kinds of minimum standards that we're trying to use at the Fairwork project, but they are still quite minimal. And really the main issue with all of these is the lack of enforcement. Even before the platform economy, you had wage theft and labor market violations sort of at a scale that is truly appalling. Particularly in the UK, I did some research. Hopefully we'll have a paper coming out on this in the hospitality industry soon. It's just the likelihood that you will get an inspection from any sort of labor market enforcement agent is over 1 in a million. The only real mechanisms to address and enforce your rights were trade unions and collective bargaining and adequate representation at work. But that's been undermined and undercut, and which is reflected in the sort of lowering labor share of income, as I mentioned in my first slide. There is the general data protection regulation, which is good, but it largely focuses on consumer data. So it limits consumer data, but it still allows for 5 different other ways to process data, which puts workers at risk. And so there has been some work in trying to update this or tweak that, but I think what we really need is a different kind of thinking on a different set of legislation that's specifically designed for workers. So I have some ideas around that. The first one is basically drawn straight from the Labour Party manifesto of 2017 and 2019, in the establishing or basically reestablishing like workers' protection and employment rights, and making these powers enforceable and having real penalties for bad employers who break the law, and also reinstituting sectoral collective bargaining. I mean, I think this is the most straightforward way to ensure workers' rights and ensure that the platforms don't take advantage of contractual loopholes and bogus self-employment and the lack of labor market enforcement. Beyond that, I think there's a sort of other interesting ways, like that basically take advantage of some of the data infrastructure that we have already, and just putting my light on here. And sort of collect data around technologies that are being used, whether it be AIs or algorithms, or what kinds of data is collected, and then have a duty to report that, much like your annual accounting and tax returns. So, you could update the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights to create an explicit duty on employers to do this. And then I have a couple more ideas before I finish. Democratic ownership schemes for workers. So this is like proposed by Piketty. Having workers allowed to vote in matters that concern them. This is a different way of rethinking the way that collective bargaining used to work, but it's one lever or one different sort of policy that could help improve democratic accountability and conditions. Co-determined rights to data was also allows workers to have stakeholdership. And then a bit broader beyond just the workplace, building a sort of public data commons, so we don't have all the resources and knowledge about whether it be or consumer behavior or transport siloed into private platforms such as Uber or Amazon or so on and so forth. So they're like Francesca Bria in Barcelona has been doing some really interesting and cool stuff down there about building a sort of data commons around the public transportation infrastructure. There's a lot of different ways we could take it. So I think that brings me up to time, and thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Matthew. That was really an interesting presentation. So much things that we can talk about. So
I'm sharing